Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. On today's episode of me talking about 7 things, I'm going to be going over Season 19, Episode 2, No Tools Allowed. Now before I continue, please check out the links in the description below. Please check out those surveys that I have there. If you haven't voted already, please do so if you would like. And it requires a Google sign-in, so you can only vote once. So feel free to share the links and advertise for who you want to be voted for. Now, at the beginning of the episode, we see Kai talking about doing a 14-day no tools challenge, which she has wanted to do for a very long time. And we see that Dan will also be participating in this challenge. And they are going to Thailand during monsoon season. And according to Kai on one of her live video Q&As, I believe the one she had with Ernie, she talked about how each morning crew would go out along the beach and pick up any garbage or anything that washes ashore, so it's a purely no tools challenge. So it is different from Castaway, so there is a bit of a difference there. And we see Dan and Kai practicing before their challenge because, with no tools, you gotta get what you can from nature. And the episode is also 90 minutes long as opposed to 2 hours, and I think that the length was really good to show everything that happened and to show off their skills and whatnot, and didn't become monotonous or boring at all. I thought it was a very interesting episode. And Kai and Dan talk about how many challenges they've done and kind of where they started. And Kai is on her 8th challenge, and she started on season 1. She's done the Naked and Afraid of Sharks special. She did an Alone challenge. She did Frozen XL and Last One Standing season 2 in Africa and Last One Standing season 3 in Australia. And on Last One Standing season 2, she managed to make it to the finals, but unfortunately in Last One Standing season 3, she had to be med tapped. And her PSR is a 9.7. And this is Dan's 6th challenge. He started out as a fan and did a 14-day fan challenge in Mexico. He did a 21-day challenge in the Chihuahuan Desert. He did 60 days in the Peruvian Amazon. And he did 2 seasons of Last One Standing. And on the second Last One Standing, he won. And his PSR is a 10.0 because of that. And they are in Thailand, and the two are inserted and jump off the boat and swim to shore. And one thing I didn't realize until the end of the episode is neither of them had a map, so that's probably a first for a challenge, is no map to start out with. Once they get to shore, they start prioritizing getting a blade and making a shelter. Kai finds a rock and makes a little blade from it using flint napping. I think that's what it's called. She used the flint napping, and she uses a bigger rock to hit a smaller rock to get a chunk to come out that's really sharp, and so that works out in their favor. And they find some coconuts, and they explore to find a place to make a shelter. And once they do kind of find a good spot, they decide on a lean-to debris shelter, and Kai begins clearing the area while Dan looks for long bamboo poles. And he finds some water, but they can't really use it at the moment because they have nothing to boil water in, and they can't boil water because they don't have a fire. And they begin working on their shelter, and Kai talks about a water gathering method where they use kind of a gutter style roof system where they have halve, the bamboo, and they have it kind of in a U shape that would collect water, and it would go into a larger piece of bamboo, and then there would be some holes in that piece of bamboo so they could have little reservoirs, and it's a very good collecting method for rainwater. And Dan works on trying to open up some coconuts, and his PSR goes from 10 to 9.9 because he's getting dehydrated and isn't getting water immediately from the coconuts. And I also noticed that Kai seems to be the designated sayer of this is a no tools challenge, and Dan is the designated we need water sayer, at least in the beginning part of the challenge. I feel that's brought up a lot to emphasize how difficult this challenge is. And luckily, Kai brings a coconut to camp that has water on it, and the two can get a little bit rehydrated. And then night falls, and the two settle into their shelter. Kai finds a large centipede and has to dispatch it to make sure it doesn't bite her, and her PSR goes from a 9.7 to a 9.8. Day 2, and Kai mentions making the rainwater catching system and prioritizing water over fire. They begin work on the gutter system, which is difficult with no tools, and luckily they're able to get that all together before the end of the day, night 2, and they really want and need rain because they're saying how it's monsoon season and, it should be raining all the time, but, the rain can come out of nowhere, but, the one time you're asking for rain and it doesn't come, at least at first. And then Dan talks about how thirsty he is, and I feel like him mentioning how thirsty he is sort of a editing method to make everyone more anxious, like, oh no, are they going to get water? They really need water right now. And you can't just live off coconuts because stomach reasons. And then day 3, and there's still no rain. And then the plan for the day is make a fire. Kai makes a braided cord to make a bow drill, and she starts trying to make a fire with the bow drill method. And there's a little tip that pops up on screen that says using the same wood species for both the spindle and board often works best. And then they try a few different methods, such as the fire saw, but unfortunately they're not able to get fire right away. And Dan's PSR drops to a 9.8 as fire continues to evade them. But fortunately, Kai, as she's walking along the beach, she finds a rock that can be used as a flint, and they decide to go for the percussion fire making method. And Dan is able to make sparks, but since it's so light out, they can't see it, so they decide to wait until nightfall to try to use the percussion method. And during the night, they have everything ready, and they both use the percussion method, the flint method, where they just hit a rock against the rock to create sparks. And one of the sparks that Dan makes catches, and then there's a dramatic commercial break, and then when they come back, Dan successfully makes fire. Hooray for them. And his PSR goes from a 9.8 to a 9.9. Day 4, and Kai goes hunting for hermit crabs, which she finds, and the two have breakfast after cooking them on the fire. Then they try to find a good way to boil water without the container fracturing. Day 5, and they are getting stomach issues from the coconuts, and Kai's PSR drops from a 9.8 to a 9.6. And then later that night, Dan has stomach issues, and his PSR goes from 9.9 to 9.7. And they are talking about they need fresh water as soon as they can. And the next day, they are hoping for rain, but it still hasn't come. And Dan tests to see if the water he found on day 1 is fresh or if it's brackish, but he does find that it is fresh water. And so they try to use bamboo as a container to hold the water, and they try to boil it over the fire. But unfortunately, the bamboo they're using starts fracturing, and they really need green bamboo, but unfortunately, since they don't have a blade, they're not really able to get it. And Dan's PSR goes from a 9.7 to a 9.5, and Kai's goes from a 9.6 to a 9.4. That night, they hear thunder in the distance, and then fortunately, it starts to rain. That morning, they check to see their gutter water collecting system, and they luckily have a bunch of water in the reservoir, and they're successfully able to have their first fresh water in the challenge, which is good. Kai's PSR goes from a 9.4 to a 9.6, and Dan's goes from a 9.5 to a 9.7. And so, day 8, and the two are getting hydrated with their new rainwater reservoir of water. Dan makes a 4-pronged spear and goes crab hunting and manages to get some, and Dan and Kai feast. Night 10, and the two realize the water in their reservoir has stagnated and doesn't really taste really good, which is not great because that means they need to try to find a way to boil the water so they don't end up getting sick. Day 11, and the two begin planning on making their raft. They want to make kind of a catamaran-like raft where there's a bunch of bamboo poles next to each other in the middle, and then a little bit off to the side there are two to kind of help balance it. And they use fire to cut the bamboo to the right size and lash them together. Day 12, and there are no rain clouds. They wanted to retry boiling water in bamboo without it catching on fire, so they decided to use coals to heat up the container so there's no direct flame on the container. And then during the survival kit section, we see Kai talking about the different bed setups, and she shows her bed setup, which is bamboo slats that are slightly raised, and then we see Dan's, which is like coconut husks on the sand where he has a hole dug for his hips, so it's nice and comfy. And then we come back from commercial break, and we see that their new water boiling method has worked, so they're able to get fresh water from that, which is good. And Dan's PSR goes from a 9.7 to a 9.8, and Kai's goes from a 9.6 to a 9.7. Day 14, and it is extraction day. They have a sign that says no tools, no problem, which I thought was interesting, and the two take the raft and head towards extraction. That's 3 miles away. They have no map, so they just kind of go in the right direction, and hopefully they'll find the shipping lane where they'll be picked up by a boat. And so after a few hours of paddling, they successfully make it to extraction. Congratulations on Kai for finishing her 8th challenge and Dan for finishing his 6th challenge. And Dan lost 16 pounds, maintains his perfect 10.0 PSR, and has 199 challenge days completed. Kai lost 6 pounds and her PSR goes to 9.9, which is the PSR that's tied with Matt, and she has 155 survival days. All in all, a good episode. It seems that a lot of people online are wondering why they didn't try different water filtration methods to try and get clean water. And Kai clarified how there's kind of a difference between filtration and purification, where if you dig a seep well, that's mainly just getting the bigger particles out of the water, but it doesn't really keep out bacteria. And this same thing with making a natural water filter with like coal and stuff, where some of the odor causing bacteria can be caught by the coal and some of the bigger particles are taken out, but it doesn't really get rid of a lot of the bacteria. And Dan and Kai were focused on purifying the water, and a lot of people are saying, oh, why not use the rock boiling method? And I don't know if Kai has clarified or posted anywhere, but my assumption is that because the bamboo was so fragile, it might have been damaged by putting in hot rocks. Plus, they would need smaller hot rocks and it might not have even worked. And if you try to dig a seep well, they didn't really have anything to help insulate the water. So I'm sure once they started putting really hot rocks in, all that heat would kind of disperse. And so it might have made things more difficult anyway. So it's all very interesting. I believe Dan and Kai are having a live at some point in the future, and hopefully they'll clarify it there. But I thought they did a really good job, and it's really cool to see them come back. I hope we can see them in the future. I really hope Kai can get the perfect 10.0 PSR. She deserves it, and I hope Matt can get the perfect 10.0 PSR. But thank you all so much for listening. Next episode is Like, Subscribe, Survive. In a first ever episode, 5 social media influencers will attempt to use their primitive skills to survive 14 days on a rugged, remote island in Thailand. So that'll be very interesting to see. Thank you all so much. Please like, comment nice things, and subscribe. And I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thank you. Bye-bye.